Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 501, Subclass Evolution and New Unique Skill, Part Half. Shangwen Bingshui had been a proud person from a very young age. She didn't quite understand the reason, but she always felt that bothering too much with others would be beneath her character. However, it was with the passing of time that the pride of Shangwen Bingshui began to get hurt after she understood that she and her mother had been pushed aside by the man named Zhuanyuan Wenchen. It was not only her pride that was touched but the anger that she had always been holding inside her precisely due to the fact that she believed it was beneath her to feel it began to rise up because of this man who had caused so much suffering to the one she loved the most. When Chen He met Shangwen Bingshui about 20 years ago, she was already a very pretty and proud child who does not lower her head even in front of adults so naturally. She had many problems at school as teachers often complained. Fortunately, Shangwen Bingshui was an extremely bright girl who even at the age of 7 could solve high school equations without any difficulty, so all the teachers had no choice but to keep their mouths shut. A woman as bright, outstanding, proud, and beautiful as her was what Chen He had always been looking for in his life. He believed that only such a woman could be by his side. However, Shangwen Bingshui was the only woman who managed to shake his arrogance from the ground up when she not only rejected him when they were teenagers but never showed any emotion for him in life other than friendly appreciation. As time went by, Chen He became more mature and his natural arrogance receded so much that it was practically nowhere to be seen despite being as outstanding as he was and despite having such a powerful backing. He continued improving himself, believing that as the years went by his longtime crush would notice him, but then, the apocalypse broke out. Chen He had seen with his own eyes how step by step that proud and arrogant woman who practically never smiled began to change. She began to smile more, she even became more joking, her mood was higher than usual, and all this had been thanks to a man with whom she had never had any interaction in the past due to the colossal difference in status and for whom she felt disgust during the first days of this new evolutive era. But despite all this, despite the fact that the reason she was beginning to change was another man and it was not him who made her smile like that, Chen He felt really happy in the midst of his little inner bitterness. After all, Shangwen Bingshui was starting to show more human emotions and no longer felt like a block of frozen ice, which meant that she was also starting to enjoy her life more. However, what had just happened had been the straw that broke the camel's back. The young archer seemed to realize something as he looked at Shangwen Bingshui on one knee and looking at Xietain with seriousness. And that was that even if Shangwen Bingshui was not in love with Xietain, Chen He was sure now that if they were both the only two men in existence and she had to choose one of the two, unfortunately, the comeback he expected from her would never come. Chen He sighed, and as he looked at the crimson sunset with the same sadness that his love had looked a few seconds ago, he for the first time in his life thought of an idea that in the past would never have even crossed his mind. Bingshui, you. Xietain looked at her with wide eyes. To him, Shangwen Bingshui was a dignified and proud woman, just like a white lotus growing silently on the highest peak in the world to show its beauty only to the one able to reach the top. Therefore, seeing her on one knee in submission was really a great shock to Xietain. While the battlefield was deathly silent, Shangwen Bingshui slowly stood up and looked Xietain in the eyes as she said in a clear voice, "Do you trust me?" "Of course, I do." Xietain nodded, still confused. If he didn't trust her, then it was impossible for him to delegate such an important position to her and entrust her with tasks that he would only feel safe doing by himself. "You trust me?" Shangwen Bingshui nodded without much emotion. Then, she asked, "To what extent do you trust me?" Xietain this time did not answer right away, and seeing Shangwen Bingshui's serious look, he realized that what she was looking for was not pretty words but an answer from him that came from deep in his heart. He lowered his head to think but didn't have to consider it too much. The answer had been there for a while now, only that maybe Xietain hadn't realized it. "To be honest, even I am surprised by this." Xietain looked her in the eyes and said in a voice that only she and those nearby could hear, "Bingshui, you don't know this, but I received a passive skill that literally makes me colder and more indifferent to others, and this is especially true for the opposite gender. I find it extremely difficult to trust people, and to date, only one person has managed to break that barrier due to different factors. Now, I can confidently say that you are the second one." The effect of the Stoneheart skill had no way to be countered, and even if it could be, no one could really hurt Xietain, as this was a passive skill that affected his emotions for others and not his overall combat strength. Therefore, he wasn't afraid to expose it at all, and even less so in front of the few people who were listening to him right now. "I wasn't so sure before, but after what happened in the Oblong world I can safely say that I'd trust you enough to put my safety in your hands." Xietain nodded earnestly toward her. Although at that moment the personality of Xietain was being slightly affected by the remnant effect of the second activation of the passive skill God of War's Will, Xietain was certain that a remnant effect could not appease the lingering effect of the passive skill Stoneheart. Therefore, The fact that he had completely closed his connection with the outside world despite being in such a dangerous battlefield could only mean that he fully trusted in Shangguan Bingshui. Shangguan Bingshui, just like everyone else, was shocked by Bei Zimin's revelation. No, she was even more surprised that he possessed such a skill and quickly began to realize many things that did not make sense to her before. How was it possible that a young man who came from a normal family like Bei Zimin and whose highest goal in life should be to perhaps get a good job actually didn't blink an eye when it came to killing, and that even in the worst circumstances he kept a clear head? Unless he was a lunatic who had secretly always had some problems, such things did not make any sense in Shangguan Bingshui's eyes. However, if all of this was being provoked or driven by the effect of a passive skill, then it all made sense. Furthermore, Shangguan Bingshui could not deny that she felt a bit proud to know that she had accomplished the practically impossible, and despite being curious as to who the other person was, she preferred not to ask about it and simply said with a faint smile, "Since it is like that, then please rest and allow yourself to be healed." She suddenly frowned and looked at his severed arm as she said in a low voice, "That arm of yours." "Oh, this?" Bei Zimin said, seemingly unconcerned. "Don't worry. I think I can do something about it." She looked at him to see if she could see any glimmer of a lie in the gates of his soul, but seeing his clear gaze she finally ended up nodding. "Okay. You do your own thing and I'll do what I think needs to be done." Although Bei Zimin was curious about the words of Shangguan Bingshui and did not understand what she meant, he was not going to ask anything about it as it would not look good at all after saying that he trusted her with his life. Therefore, after telling Shangguan Bingshui all right, he walked over to Kang Lan and urged her to evolve her recovery skill, bringing her out of her daze. The most powerful healing mage of the Transcendent faction, despite all the surprise she felt after learning that so many catastrophic and miraculous events had happened, immediately set to work on what Bei Zimin entrusted to her in the hope that she could help him recover his severed arm. Slowly but surely, soul stone after soul stone began to be consumed. On the other hand, Shangguan Bingshui stood upright in front of everyone and watched the expressions of those in front of her with ice-cold eyes as she silently tightened the large ragged cloak covering her body. Under everyone's watchful eyes and closed mouths, Shangguan Bingshui slowly opened her soft pink lips and in a clear voice began to narrate what happened in the Oblong world. She explained everything with enough clarity for even a 2-year-old to understand the danger beyond the space portal, and gave enough detail that everyone present could draw clear pictures in their heads. From the explosive increase in gravity that made it difficult to move in the training they underwent in the beginning, to carefully detailing the first confrontation she and Bei Zimin experienced against the Asuras on Oblong world when a new army of over 100,000 enemies, among which there were over 40,000 First-Order beings and 20 Second-Order beings. Just the description of the first battle had left everyone breathless and scared to death. The soldiers trembled and their hands filled with sweat as they clenched their weapons tightly, and even the strongest soul evolver in the place could not help but feel some fear in her heart. After all, an army that possessed several thousand First-Order beings and 20 Second-Order beings were more than enough to flatten the entire Baichuan camp in a minute, and ruling China would only be a matter of time. But Shangguan Bingshui was far from being done. She gave her 200% to explain how a third-order existence fell from the sky just like a legendary god and whose power was enough to knock down a mountain with a single punch. However, even such a being was taken down by Bei Zimin. Everyone was in shock and disbelief as Shangguan Bingshui described how Bei Zimin delved alone into the dangerous unknown world despite being slightly injured after defeating and killing the third-order enemy, while she stayed behind to protect the portal and prevent other enemies from reaching Earth. Shangguan Bingshui described in clear detail how she killed over 30 Second-Order beings and at least 20,000 First-Order beings who tried to reach Earth while Bei Zimin was away. However, she downplayed many of her own merits and even left out the fact that she fought to the death against a giant beast that was infinitely close to the Third Order in order to protect Bei Zimin. After all, Shangguan Bingshui's goal was mostly to try to emphasize his feats and not hers. Thanks for the super gifts guys. Less than 3 another choppy in a few minutes and another one later. Really thank you very much to all those who send gifts to the novel and support with valuable golden tickets. I hope we can all keep it up. Less than 3. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 502, Subclass Evolution and New Unique Skill, Part 2 halves. Everyone's breath caught in their lungs as Shangguan Bingshui described how from over 2,000 kilometers away, the thunderous explosions shook the earth beneath their feet in an attempt to describe as much as possible how terrifying each one of the shockwaves resulting from the deadly battle that Bei Zimin waged for over 2 hours against a tremendously strong being was. Everyone's imagination went wild as their mind raced as if it were a cinematic movie replaying a scene they did not see but seemed to witness thanks to Shangguan Bingshui's clever and careful recounting. Excitement coursed through the veins of every soul evolver and soldier, but what they felt most was pressure and fear. Just the resulting shockwaves and explosions were enough to make someone as powerful as Shangwen Bingshui, who could now slaughter second-order enemies with no apparent problem, feel helpless. How fierce had been the battle that Bei Xiemin had experienced then, none of them could imagine. Third order? It didn't seem to be possible considering that he had killed one quite easily before. So, fourth order? Everyone's eyes slowly began to change as they listened more and more. At this point, they didn't seem to be looking at a human or a monster. When they looked at Bei Xiemin, they seemed to be looking at the incarnation of God. Shangwen Bingshui nodded in satisfaction as she observed the changes everyone was experiencing. Even the soldiers who had surrendered today were not much different, and every time they looked at Bei Xiemin, the light of hope shone in everyone's eyes. To be honest, Shangwen Bingshui had wanted to do this for a long time. In her eyes, Bei Xiemin possessed power, skill, intelligence, and vision enough to rule. What he lacked, however, was political cunning, something that in order to accomplish the goal of overthrowing her father, Shangwen Bingshui had developed from an early age. Bei Xiemin believed that he needed to show his strength to make others become obedient or submissive. However, in Shangwen Bingshui's eyes his approach was poor. Who said that someone who aimed to rule everything under the heavens had to make everyone obedient and submissive? He didn't need to show anything. All he needed to do was to exaggerate his achievements a bit so that the rumors would spread far enough for those who did not witness them to narrate his feats for years to come. With the strength of Bei Xiemin, he only needed a little bit of intelligence and political cunning to put the whole world within his grasp. This was something Shangwen Bingshui was confident of for sure. She had not done what she was doing now solely and exclusively because she wanted him to figure out for himself what he needed to move forward. However, Shangwen Bingshui now realized her mistake. Wasn't she aiming to become someone capable of supporting him? Wasn't what she was doing now helping him to lead? Not everything had to be limited to swords and magic. Words also had their own charm, even more so her words. Shangwen Bingshui's eyes occasionally glowed unnaturally with unusual lights. However, everyone was stupefied and in an apparent trance as they listened to what she said, so no one noticed this little fact. During her not-so-pleasant stay in Oblong World, while Bei Xiemin was fighting in the distance and after she had finished off all the enemies that appeared non-stop, Shangwen Bingshui had taken brief moments of rest to evolve one of her main skills, but one that she did not use very often. Charming Eyes, third order active skill, level 1. Consumes 30 mana points to activate. Its power now depends on the magic power and the magic stat of the user, so the higher the magic power and the higher the magic stat of the user, the more powerful the days will be and the longer it will last on beings whose general power is lower. You now have a certain chance of enchanting beings one order above you. The skill has a cooldown of 1 hour. Second activation. Sacred Word, consumes 5 mana points to activate and 1 mana point per second to maintain the activation. Imbues all your magic in your gaze and transforms your eyes into magical objects capable of enhancing the effect of your words to a great extent depending on the difference in soul power and purity of the same. Shangwen Bingshui had consumed more than 10 second-order soul stones and many more first-order soul stones while she was still in Oblong World to evolve her skill a whole order. Of course, she did not evolve her skill all at once and did it little by little as she obtained the necessary soul stones and fulfilled the various requirements the skill imposed to her. However, it was worth it as even a second activation called Sacred Word was coming in handy now. A faint smile similar to that of a clever little fox appeared on her face unnoticed, and as she glanced over her shoulder slyly she noticed that Kanglan and Bei Xiemin were busy with their things. Then, she went on to narrate the match with the Asura Emperor and the most powerful being she had ever seen in her entire life. As Shangwen Bingshui gave her speech, Bei Xiemin did not know what to say about it. Although she was far from lying, Bei Xiemin could not help but feel that she was exaggerating things a bit. Of course, Bei Xiemin did not know that Shangwen Bingshui was being honest and was simply describing how she felt at that moment. To her, what he managed to do in Oblong World were feats that everyone on Earth should know about, since Shangwen Bingshui saw it as unfair that while everyone was sleeping comfortably or gazing at him waiting for the chance to usurp everything he had, he was dying fighting for the sake of this world. Suddenly I feel like I'm a hero without a cape. Well, my cape was taken from me by her, so. Bei Xiemin muttered under his breath as he looked at Shangwen Bingshui. He shook his head and looked at his severed arm in pain. Honestly, he lied earlier. Bei Xiemin wasn't so sure he could reconnect his arm. He tried to put it back together using blood manipulation, but there was no way to succeed as the severed and destroyed tissues could not be reattached so quickly, and unfortunately, Bei Xiemin was aware that it was only a matter of time before his left arm started to rot. His concern was so high that Bei Xiemin could not even worry about the golden spear at this point, and instead, he decided to take several soul stones to evolve a skill that he believed would help him recover without having to lose the potion. After all, while consuming valuable high-ranked soul stones would cause the heart of Bei Xiemin to ache, The evolved skill would forever be with him, helping him day by day, but Xietain had no way of obtaining another potion right away, so in his eyes the red potion was of greater value even than the fourth order soulstone that he reclaimed when Jack died after being impaled by the spear. However, just then, something Xietain did not expect happened. Congratulations. The intelligent existences under your rule are now over 10,000 and they all see you as a worthy and respectable leader to follow. Keep it up. Your subclass lower leader has evolved to the next stage. Lord, increase your overall power by 3% and by 0.1% for every 2,000 inhabitants under your rule up to a maximum of 200%. The number of loyal followers you can appoint is now increased to 5 and those who become your loyal follower will never be able to betray you. In addition, each of your loyal followers will have access to 10% of your total strength in life and death situations and will have access to 2% of your strength without affecting you when they go into combat mode. You have received a hidden reward for being the first human on planet Earth to manage to build a strong faction from the ground up with your own hands and without relying on pre-evolution means. All for one. All for one. Third order unique skill, level 5. Transfer 100% of your power to one of your loyal followers for 24 hours or vice versa. The skill has a cooldown of 2 months. This skill cannot be evolved by normal means. Possible evolution requirements are unknown. Xietain's movements stalled as disbelief flashed in his dazed gaze. What? For a moment, Xietain's brain failed to process the situation before he recalled what was happening. Indeed. When Xietain checked, he realized that he had suddenly fulfilled the requirements for his lower leader subclass to advance to the next stage. But how had this happened? Xietain was of course happy, but he was also confused. His faction in the north would need at least 3 or 4 more days, maybe even longer, for the number of survivors under his standard to exceed 10,000 and more time for all of them, or at least the necessary number, to see him as a leader worth to follow. On the other hand, even though Xietain would meet the requirement now that he had taken over Baichuan camp, he still needed more time for the survivors and the troops to see him as a real leader to follow and not someone they would follow just because they had no choice but to do so. All in all, Xietain had estimated that he might need another week or even half a month to get his subclass to evolve. Therefore, he was confused about this sudden breakthrough. Was it her? Xietain looked at Shangguan Bingshui in surprise. However, his surprise turned to shock when he saw the fervent gazes that the soldiers and soul evolvers who belonged to Baichuan camp and who had surrendered with no choice a few hours ago. It was as if they were looking at the God of salvation who had descended to expel the darkness and evil from their lives instead of looking at a human being. Whatever Shangguan Bingshui had done, Xietain had no words to thank her enough. After all, he seriously doubted that just a few words would be enough to affect the mentality of so many people so suddenly. Now, with his subclass having advanced, Xietain could feel his overall power shooting up slightly and the wounds that plagued his body began to heal faster than before. Furthermore, Xietain was very thankful that now the 100% limit had been extended to double what it was before, and even the number of loyal followers he could recruit now exceeded twice as many as he currently had. More surprising was the fact that his loyal followers could not only use 10% of his total strength in life and death situations as opposed to the previous 5%, but now they also received 2% of Xietan's overall strength just for going into combat mode. One had to know that 2% of each and every one of Xietan's trackable and untraceable stats represented a slight boost of power that could not be ignored in a deadly battle between two equal beings. After all, Xietain was not a first-order existence that could be casually judged. However, what left Xietain most speechless was the hidden reward. He had just received another unique skill without even expecting it. Yes, again, Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 503, Do you wish to continue the evolution process? The skill All for One was undoubtedly a skill worthy of the word unique. Although Xietain did not know exactly what the most noticeable differences between normal skills and unique skills were, the two unique skills that Xietain had received so far were undoubtedly tremendously powerful. For example, the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath that Xietain managed to unlock during the war against the Goblin race when the leader of the Goblin race located in northern China was a skill that in Xietan's eyes could simply be described as a godly skill. After all, depending on the level of Wrath awaken, even a normal human could receive more than enough power to fight against a third-order existence that had spent tens of years and even centuries to acquire such power or even more. That was how powerful the unique skills were, and the newly acquired All for One was definitely not far behind despite the clear difference it had with Blood Berserker's Wrath. Although Xietain had yet to test the skill All for One, it was clear that it was a skill that should not be used unless there was really no choice but to use it. Because unlike the first few levels of the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath and leaving aside the last two more dangerous levels, the skill All for One was undoubtedly a lot more dangerous than the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath. For example, If Xietain was badly injured or for unknown reasons could not fight with his 100%, he could entrust his full strength to one of his loyal followers without worrying about being betrayed, and that chosen loyal follower would be able to use not only his slasher strength but would also be able to use Xietan's full strength to protect him from danger for a full 24 hours. In return, however, Xietain or the loyal follower who transfers his slasher strength would automatically become harmless lambs. Even if Xietain didn't need to worry about a possible betrayal by any of his loyal followers, becoming defenseless and falling to a mere normal human for a full day was definitely not something he wanted to experience unless he really had no choice but to do so. Besides, there were many things that still needed to be checked regarding the skill All for One. For example, Xietain didn't know if by full strength it meant only the soul power or if his skills would also be transferred to the loyal follower or if the leer follower's skills would be transferred to him. In case Xietain wanted to transfer his power to a loyal follower and in case the skills would not be transferred, then unless that loyal follower was tremendously experienced in combat or had a skill similar to the skill Special Forces soldier that Xietain possessed, the loyal follower's true battle power would still be less than the battle power that Xietain would be able to show despite having the same overall power level due to the clear difference in combat experience. An appreciated skill that needs to be studied. Xietain concluded with a murmur that only he could hear. Just then, Shangwen Bingshui looked at him over her shoulder and Xietain couldn't help but smile at her and nod slightly. She tilted her head in an extremely cute way while looking at him with confusion, but Xietain just chuckled and gently shook his head without saying anything about it. He was really grateful for whatever Shangwen Bingshui had done. After all, not only had Xietan's overall power increased a bit but he had received another powerful trump card that could save his life at crucial moments. If Xietain did have the skill All for One before invading the Oblong world, then he wouldn't need to suffer as much as he had suffered. Pushing what had just happened to the back of his mind and preparing to ask Shangwen Bingshui later about it, Xietain closed his eyes and focused for several seconds until he finally reached the part of his soul where the records of two skills were located. One of these skills was superhuman health and the other skill was regeneration. Superhuman health was a passive skill that directly affected Xietan's health stat and thus his body's recovery rate as well as his immunity to countless normal or deadly diseases. Moreover, after evolving to the maximum level of the First Order, the skill Superhuman Health passively increased the effect of healing skills on Xietain by a large 20%. On the other hand, the skill Regeneration was an active skill but of the same level and order as Superhuman Health. So far, Xietain had never been forced into a situation where he needed to activate Regeneration even once. After all, the number of beings capable of blocking magical attacks he had faced so far were only two and neither of them lasted long enough to deplete Xietan's stamina before they perished. Therefore, until today, the skill Regeneration had been without a doubt the most useless skill in Xietan's arsenal. Although right now Xietain had a few tens of second-order soul stones at his disposal counting the ones he had brought and the ones Shangwen Bingshui had managed to gather, such high-ranked soul stones were treasures that needed to be carefully invested. Therefore, Xietain needed to think very carefully about which skill he would evolve next. After careful thought and even though logic said that the safest evolution was undoubtedly Superhuman Health, Xietain, who hated to follow definite paths, decided to take the risk again. But, hey! Hadn't he been taking risks since day one when it all started? It was precisely because Xietain had been brave enough to dare to walk blindfolded and because he had risked so much that he had managed to get to where he was now, a being that even a third-order existence had to respect. After all, safe paths would surely be able to lead Xietain to the road of greatness, yet he aspired not only to greatness but to total and absolute domination. Therefore, he had to walk paths that were brimming with danger and risk. Only by risking enough could one obtain great rewards. Play big or go home. Regeneration, First Order active skill, Level 5, Evolution requirements. All stats plus 200 natural points, complete. First Order Soul Stone, 7/7. Second Order Soul Stone, 2/2. Do you wish to continue the evolution process, starting strong from the beginning, eh? Xietain sighed softly. Although he had expected something like this, the reality was as cruel as ever. Plus 200 natural stat points in each of the 6 trackable stats was insane without a doubt. After all, a powerful existence at the peak of the First Order would hover around that amount of stat points but possibly in a single stat or maybe 2. As for the 6, probably only a second-order creature would be able to afford such luxuries. Simply put, were it not for the fact that Xietain was Xietain, possibly only Shangwen Bingshui and his entire faction would be able to barely evolve the skill Regeneration to the next stage while still a first-order being. Not to mention the big number of soul stones of considerable rank that would be needed. After all, If not for the fact that Bei Xietain and Shangwen Bingshui were monsters among monsters, it was unlikely that another existence would be able to gather so many high-ranked soul stones at their scale of power. Even someone like Evangeline, who was tremendously powerful, was barely able to fight against around 5 first-order beasts at the same time at present, and to date, she had never obtained a second-order soul stone by herself. Therefore, even though the requirements seemed to be simple, this was only so because Bei Xietain was Bei Xietain, but in reality, it was far from a simple thing to achieve. Regardless, since Bei Xietain had made his decision, he would not back down no matter what. Therefore, he agreed to continue with the evolution, and soon the skill regeneration began to grow to new heights. Regeneration, second order active skill, level 1. Regenerates 2 stamina points for every 1 mana point consumed. No cooldown time. Although it had been a simple evolution, the improvement was undoubtedly remarkable. Going from consuming 2 mana points to regenerate 1 stamina point to the opposite was undoubtedly a great growth. However, Bei Xietain was far from happy. In his eyes, this skill was still far from being worthy of such high evolutionary requirements, and asking for so many first-order soul stones and even 2 second-order soul stones for this crap was no different from daylight robbery. Bei Xietain gritted his teeth and continued evolving the skill anyway. There was no way he would back down now. Regeneration, second order, level 1. Greater than regeneration, second order, level 2. All stats plus 220 natural points, complete. First order soul stone, 5/5. Second order soul stone, 1/1. Do you wish to continue the evolution process? Yes. Regeneration, second order, level 2. Greater than regeneration, second order, level 3. All stats plus 240 natural points, complete. First order soul stone, 7/7. Second order soul stone, 1/1. Do you wish to continue the evolution process? Yes. Regeneration, second order, level 3, greater than regeneration, second order, level 4. All stats plus 260 natural points, complete. First order soul stone, 10/10. Second order soul stone, 1/1. Do you wish to continue the evolution process? Yes. Regeneration, second order active skill, level 5, regenerates 10 stamina points for every 1 mana point consumed. No cooldown time, 10 stamina points in exchange for only 1 mana point. Undoubtedly, it was a more than worthy exchange. However, far from being happy, the face of Bei Xietain was as pale as a sheet, not having noticed the changes he expected in the skill. When Bei Xietain decided to take up one of the 5 free slots he had to learn active skills with the skill regeneration, it was because something inside him told him that he would not regret it. However, the regret threatened to grow at any moment. Bei Xietain had consumed 6 second-order soul stones and 34 first-order soul stones to bring the skill regeneration from first-order level 5 to second-order level 5. Such consumption was simply monstrous and was far from something that many in a world that was just beginning to evolve could afford. Even beings that inhabited worlds in their second evolutionary stage would probably bleed from expending so many second-order and first-order soul stones just like that. Although the evolution had not been bad, the skill regeneration was far from turning into what Bei Xietain expected it to become. Furthermore, he had already consumed about 1/6 of all the second-order soul stones that the Transcendent faction currently had. Under such disappointment, it would be impossible for Bei Xietain not to feel hesitation, and the feeling of wanting to back out threatened to rise in his heart. However, just as this was happening, Bei Xietain felt something very strange inside him calling out to him and urging him to keep going. Bei Xietain did not know what this strange feeling was, but it was something that had been with him for as long as he could remember. His parents often teased him, saying that it was his little gift when even without studying he got good grades in school thanks to the multi-choice section. Hesitantly, Bei Xietain checked the requirements needed to evolve the skill regeneration to the next order. Regeneration, second order active skill, level 5, evolution requirements. All stats plus 600 natural points, complete. First order soul stone, 30/30. Second order soul stone, 5/5. Third order soul stone, 1/1. Do you wish to continue the evolution process? Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 504, Lilith's plans about to break down. The requirements to evolve the skill regeneration from the maximum level of the second order to the initial level of the third order were so monstrous that the face of Bei Xietain turned pale. The number of first order soul stones was too high to evolve a single skill, while the number of second order soul stones was terrifying enough to scare anyone away. Even leaving aside the fact of needing several hundred natural stat points in each of the 6 trackable stats, the requirement of soul stones was enough for the skill regeneration to stay at that same level it was currently at for several tens of years. However, the time needed for evolution, as well as its difficulty, had skyrocketed to colossal heights with the latest requirement: a third-order soul stone. To obtain a third-order soul stone, one needed to possess the strength to engage and kill third-order existences. What did this mean? It meant that even those worlds as powerful as the Oblong world did not have enough powerhouses to casually kill third-order beings to obtain soul stones of such a high rank. In the entire Oblong world, which was ruled by 3 fourth-order powerhouses, 3 of which 2 of them briefly fought against Xietain, there were barely a couple of third-order beings, and considering that the higher the order of an existence the harder it was to find a soul stone in their heads, the difficulty of evolving regeneration to the third order could be imagined. In fact, were it not for the fact that Xietain was a monster that could not be judged by common sense, he could simply forget about evolving the skill regeneration for at least a few dozen years, and even a few centuries would not be unusual. It was clear that the skill regeneration of the third order was not a skill that a first-order existence should possess. As for why this was so, it was naturally due to the exaggeratedly high requirements. What other first-order existence besides Xietain was really capable of completing such stupidly high requirements? Xietain honestly doubted that within the Soul Record's embrace there was another being capable of doing something like this. This was not because he was arrogant, but precisely because even someone like him, who had all his stats infinitely close to 4 digits and whose power allowed him to face beings 2 stages above, feared before the records that the skill regeneration needed to acquire to evolve further. Xietain stared at the green window glowing in his retina, and his eyes were filled with hesitation. After all, he only had a single third-order soul stone, the only one in the entire faction. What if the skill regeneration continued to evolve on a path that would not head in the direction Xietain hoped to walk? Wouldn't this mean that he would be wasting large numbers of valuable soul stones, among which was even a third-order one? As the leader of a growing faction, Xietain knew that it was not right for him to take such a great risk. After all, the power contained in a third-order soul stone was enough for Xietain to build a goblin magic cannon as long as he could find some more materials. What did a goblin magic cannon represent? Basically, it meant that a well-stationed base would be protected even during the second evolutionary stage of planet Earth. It represented firepower and defense that only a horde of extremely strong enemies would be able to break through, but normal armies could put aside any fantasy of breaking through. However, Xietain was not just a faction leader. At the end of the day, and first of all, Xietain was a warrior and mage who needed to become more powerful as soon as possible. Therefore, despite all the hesitation and against what any other logical being would do, Xietain approached Shangwen Bingshui and whispered something in her ear under the eyes of everyone present. Shangwen Bingshui looked at him in confusion but did not ask too many questions and simply handed him the third-order soul stone that she even now held tightly in one of her hands, as if she feared someone would steal it from her. Xietain walked away without a word as he fiddled with the small glowing fire-red rock. He seemed to be in a sort of trance as he gathered the soul stones that would soon be consumed into a small pile, and then, with lingering fear, he tossed the third-order soul stone into the air, starting the evolution process of the skill regeneration. Swoosh. 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 A green message flashed in Xietan's retina as he confirmed that he wished to continue the process of evolving the skill. Moments later, the third-order soul stone hovered 3 or 4 meters above the ground, while the first-order and second-order soul stones flew to form a circle around the most important soul stone of all. That's. Shangwen Bingshui watched in disbelief at the unmistakable process in which a skill grew to new heights. All the soul evolvers present had experienced something similar at least once to evolve one of their skills, whether it was a level or an order. However, this time it was different. The bright light spread out powerfully with the third-order soul stone as the center, and an instant later all the soul stones began to glow brightly enough to simulate a small artificial sun that forced many nearby soldiers to look away for fear of being blinded. The power released from the small glowing sun sent shivers down the spines of almost everyone present, and even someone as powerful as Shangwen Bingshui felt incredulous. Xietain, what kind of skill? Shangwen Bingshui walked next to him and seemed to want to ask what kind of skill he was evolving as to need a third-order soul stone as she kept her gaze fixed on the sky. However, when she looked at his face and noticed his pale profile, she subconsciously stopped and watched him carefully. The face of Xietain was terribly pale, his naked torso and his face were drenched with sweat, and his right fist was clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white from lack of proper blood circulation. Shangwen Bingshui did not need to question anything as she felt the trembling in his ever-firm gaze to realize that even Xietain did not know what would come out of all this. Simply put, Xietain was once again risking everything on a single roll of the dice. Even the face of Shangwen Bingshui turned slightly pale as she realized this fact. After all, what Xietain was consuming here were huge sums of soul stones, and they were not unclassified soul stones. They were valuable soul stones that in a sense represented the future foundation of the entire faction. Now, all she could do was to pray. Because if Xietain was so nervous, then it meant that even he was not confident of getting anything good out of all this. So, if Xietan's bet turned out to be correct, all would be well, since as the leader and main source of power the entire Transcendent faction would benefit. However, if his bet ended up failing, then the losses would really be a bit unbearable. Oblong World. After asking as many questions as they thought possible, the factions of higher existences fell silent. Each leader seemed to be deep in their own thoughts as to what to do next. However, the thoughts of all were mainly focused on the spear that Sirius had thrown. Recently, Emperor Thanath had told them that the Emperor of the Ghost Race had charged toward the portal to stop Xietain in an attempt to halt the spread of the blue flames. Therefore, the fact that Jack had not returned and that Xietain had been seen by Lucifer being pulled to the other side of the portal, had made it more than clear who had emerged victorious from that battle. While Thanath was incredulous and could in no way accept that a fatally wounded First-Order existence could have taken the life of someone like Jack, who possessed power no less than his own, the higher existences understood more clearly what had happened. It was clear that Sirius' spear had killed that Fourth-Order existence. However, the question that everyone was asking but no one could answer was the following. Why didn't that First-Order lower existence die after being impaled by Sirius' spear, but the other Fourth-Order lower existence did? Star Devouring questioned. Although his beastly mouth did not move, his words reached everyone present clearly. Fire Sorrow looked at Lucifer with questioning eyes. She seemed to be more and more certain that this person called Xietain might be the reincarnation of the heavenly wolf who was once feared and respected by myriads of races. Lucifer gave her a sidelong glance and shook his head as he sighed to himself. Unlike Fire Sorrow, he understood some things much better and could also keep his mind clear by letting aside the emotions that clouded reasoning. Just then, an angel with 3 pairs of wings stepped forward and descended from the sky. 3 pairs of wings, an archangel, a being of the 7th Order. This was a handsome man wearing a white robe with gold embroidery. His black hair was tied in a delicate bun and a crown of silver leaves decorated his head. His beauty, far from being of the masculine style, could make him look like a woman were it not for certain aspects such as the firmness of his jaw. The eyes of Medes and the other members of the Army of Heaven lit up slightly at the sight of this archangel stepping forward. On the other hand, Lucifer, Lucia, Fire Sorrow, and a few members of the demonic army narrowed their eyes at the sight of him. The name of this archangel was Gabriel. Gabriel was probably the weakest 7th Order existence in the universe in terms of mere power, so much so that some of the most powerful 6th Order higher existences were capable of matching him. However, none would dare to underestimate him, and those who had done so had already perished. Gabriel was known in heaven as the most intelligent and brilliant existence in the universe. His planning was near perfect in most cases, his intelligence seemed to have transcended a new level, and his ever-calm mind helped him utilize each of his skills so optimally that even the most powerful had to take their hats off before him. "Little friend, how are you?" Gabriel smiled softly as he looked at Thanath. His voice was as soft as the spring breeze, which unconsciously ended up helping Emperor Thanath relax a bit. Of course, this was also part of Gabriel's magic. Gabriel looked at Fire Sorrow with a smile and his eyes flashed strangely before he looked back at Thanath and said slowly, "It seems that one of us here has some wild thoughts that should die to avoid suffering in the long run. How about you help us?" The Archangel Gabriel sounded like a truly holy and pious being who could not wait to help the lost lambs. However, those who knew him well enough were aware that the only thing pure about Gabriel was probably his perfectly white wings, as his mind was as scheming as anyone's. Thanath looked confused but still said dutifully, "Even though I don't know how, this young one will help in any way possible." "That's good." Gabriel nodded and his eyes curved slightly, giving him an extremely angelic appearance. He looked at Fire Sorrow and said word by word, "You just have to answer one more question, that's all. Earlier, and if I remember correctly, you said that this world was linked to another world, didn't you?" "Why, yes." Thanath nodded hesitantly before saying carefully, "This. Can the Lord Angel explain a little more? This young man is hopeless and doesn't understand." "Ha ha ha." Gabriel chuckled softly before calmly saying, "Well, it's okay, little friend. For now, let's just start with whether or not you know the name of that world." Lilith stood in a corner among the members of the demonic army as she observed everything indifferently. In fact, she wasn't worried at all despite having heard Gabriel's seemingly key question. After all, what if they knew the name of the planet? Lilith doubted that with the name of a world anyone could do anything about it. However, soon Lilith would realize that not only she was tremendously wrong but that all her plans would be one step away from complete collapse. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 505, title spoiler at the end of the name of the world to which Oblong World was connected? The Emperor of the Asura race was taken by surprise at the Archangel's question. After all, The Cosmos Gate only served to stabilize a passage in the middle of the chaotic void to allow Oblong World to invade other worlds or vice versa. Of course, the vice versa case had never happened until today, since the Cosmos Gate was created with high-rank runes that ensured Oblong World would always connect to less evolved worlds. As for the name of other worlds, even now the Emperor of the Asura race did not know them. Gabriel frowned slightly, but even then the smile on his face stayed unchanged as he said quietly, "Could it be that you don't know?" At this point, even though Gabriel was smiling, all those who knew this archangel knew that it was not for nothing that he had received the title Bloodthirsty Strategist. If there was one thing Gabriel hated and detested, it was when his plans didn't go the way he expected them to. Therefore, he would usually destroy completely anything that would prejudice his ideas in any way. Even slaughtering others just because he couldn't get what he expected from them was nothing strange. Thanath slowly began to sweat as he realized that even though the smile on the face of the archangel steps ahead had not changed, somehow the Asura Emperor felt that depending on his next words his life might be in danger of ruin. Lucifer frowned and said in disgust, "Six-winged pigeon, did you not hear what I said before? If you dare to touch this lower existence or this world, I will sweep the ground with your face to see if you can still continue smiling like that." Lucifer had promised that he and his demonic army would see to it that no one caused trouble in Oblong World or hurt its residents if Emperor Thanath was honest and answered the questions they asked. Therefore, he would keep his word no matter what. Wouldn't he, one of the most powerful beings in the universe, become a joke if word spread that the great Lucifer was nothing but a liar? Although Lucifer never cared what others might think about him, being called a liar was something he always hated. Moreover, he hated all those who did not keep their word. Gabriel pretended to be surprised as he looked at Lucifer and said in a clear voice, "Lord of the demonic army, are you trying to besmirch my good name? Our army of heaven has a better reputation than your demonic army even among the lower worlds, you know? So maybe it would be better if you would be more concerned about taming your pets instead of trying to take care of other people's pets, don't you think?" It was true that the army of heaven had a very good reputation, a lot higher than the demonic armies. Meej was known to be a caring being who had even prevented the annihilation of several races by indirectly and without breaking the rules of the soul record, supporting the natural residents of some worlds. On the other hand, Lucifer was a lazy leader, and as a consequence of the excessive freedom that the members of the demonic army had, the number of living beings that had died were so many that with the passage of time the reputation of this faction was dyed black, as well as the wings they had behind their backs. Ignoring Lucifer's frown, Gabriel looked at Fire Sorrow and said with a smile, "Besides, Lord of the demonic army, this little lamb is only trying to help correct the wayward thoughts of one of the members of your faction." Then, Gabriel looked at Lucifer back and smiled slightly as he said in a calm manner, "Won't that be of great help to you as well? You need not worry, Lord Demon. I won't do anything bad." Lucifer sighed as if he was tired of life in general. He ignored the hypocrite named Gabriel and looked at Meads lazily as he slowly said, "Hey, old man. You better put your dogs on a leash or they might eat something that is poisonous and will end their doggish lives sooner than expected." Meads frowned slightly and said in a clear voice, "Gabriel, that's enough." The smile on Gabriel's face did not change at all as he bowed to Meads and withdrew the slight murderous intent that had begun to be born unnoticed in his gaze, murderous intent that was naturally aimed at the Emperor of the Asura race. After all, the demonic army was currently far more powerful than the army of heaven. Of course, considering the strong foundation of the army of heaven, if the demonic army or any other faction wanted to eliminate them, they would definitely see their own foundations shaken to the point where they would naturally disappear with the passage of time. However, Meads did not want to clash against Lucifer now. After all, Lucifer was really powerful. Therefore, it was temporarily better to put up with some things no matter how uncomfortable they made him feel. Everyone in the army of heaven agreed with their lord. Of course, Gabriel was no different. It was just that sometimes it wasn't easy for him to suppress his temper and desire to have everything under control. "Now I remember," Thanath suddenly exclaimed aloud. His eyes shone brightly as he said cheerfully, "Even though the Cosmos Gate has no other function than to open a safe space passage to a world weaker than the Father World, I had a brief conversation with this person named Xietain, and inadvertently or not, but he did reveal the name of his world." "Oh." Gabriel's eyes twinkled like stars lighting up galaxies, and he clapped his hands softly as he pressed with a smile. "Then can you tell us what is the name of this world that this person named Xietain belongs to?" "Yes." Thanath nodded. Then, with an excited smile at being able to answer another question from the powerful higher existences before him, he revealed, "This Xietain said that the world he belongs to is called Earth. Moreover, this world is just a world that is only in its first evolutionary stage." And Thanath continued speaking non-stop as he gave all the information he knew about the world of Xietain. Aside from the name, Thanath could gather a lot of information about the worlds that the Cosmos Gate connected to Oblon World thanks to the mana that went through the portal to later be absorbed by the glowing object in the sky. However, the Asura Emperor was so excited by the fact that he had gained more credit for his race and ensured more of his own survival by avoiding raising the wrath of the powerful beings before him that he did not notice how the expression of some of the higher existences belonging to the demonic army and the army of heaven changed tremendously. Suddenly, and without anyone having time to react, Fire Sorrow suddenly teleported and appeared in front of Emperor Thanath. The next words of the Emperor of the Asura race got stuck in his throat when the beautiful face of the woman who had previously healed him of all his wounds was reflected in his pupils at an extremely close distance. Fire Sorrow reached forward with lightning speed and grabbed Thanath's neck. Then, she waved her magic staff and the sixth order soul stone that adorned the top of it lit up. Wait. Meads was the first to react and he took a step forward in an attempt to stop her, but by the time he realized what was happening, Fire Sorrow had already disappeared along with the Asura Emperor. Lucifer's eyes were wide in shock as he muttered incoherent words. Even the ever-indifferent Lucia had an expression of shock on her face. Uriel, Michael, Gabriel, and a small handful of other beings had expressions of utter disbelief on their faces. It was as if they had heard the most amazing thing in the cosmos, even though they were just words spoken by a lower existence that they would usually simply ignore and not even bother to know. Lilith blinked in surprise, but when she noticed the spatial movement, she quickly judged the possible trajectory in which Fire Sorrow was moving, and the murderous intent grew in her eyes. She drew her sword and slashed the void in front of her. A crack barely big enough to allow Lilith to pass through opened immediately, and after she stepped forward and disappeared into the pitch blackness on the other side, the crack closed again. Lucifer quickly turned around and opened a huge magical portal before dashing inside without waiting for anyone. "Move," Lucia commanded in a trembling voice before following Lucifer and disappearing. Under the strong impulse of beings like Valiant, Crow, and Helsker, all the members of the demonic army present rushed into the magical portal opened by Lucifer and disappeared in a matter of seconds. Swoosh! The portal of the demonic army had barely closed when Uriel created a huge golden magical circle that enveloped all the higher existences of the army of heaven. Seconds later, the army of heaven disappeared in its entirety as well. The other faction leaders exchanged blank looks before Salazar laughed emotively as he roared, "This looks like fun. Let me join in too." Then he waved his hand and the huge spaceships appeared. Nikolai, Eternal Phoenix, and Star Devourer naturally did not lag behind and used their means to move through space alongside their respective factions. However, when these four leaders tried to follow the spatial traces left behind by Lucifer and Uriel's magic, the expressions of all of them changed and their faces turned a bit ugly as they noticed that the perception of each of them had been blocked by some sort of high-ranking magic or treasure. "Those two bastards!" Star Devourer roared angrily. His aura naturally began to slowly affect the world as he said in fiery anger, "They really don't want to let us go to hide something important. Damn you, Meads, Lucifer." Eternal Phoenix, Nikolai, and Salazar were not happy about this fact either. However, there was nothing they could do about it. Seeing Star Devourer angry, the three of them exchanged glances and a glint of cunning shone in each of their eyes. Without a word, they simply took their faction members and disappeared using different methods of teleportation or space travel. Star Devourer in his state of rage wanted nothing more than to destroy everything. However, what little trace of rationality he had left made him realize that if he destroyed this world, his faction and the demonic army would actually become mortal enemies, since what he would be doing would be no different than kicking Lucifer's face in. Therefore, even though Star Devourer was not fearful of anything and loved to destroy things, he wisely decided to leave despite his anger. He could probably take it out on some uninhabited worlds or stars. Swoosh! Fire Sorrow didn't take too long to appear around the solar system. She clearly knew where she was going since she used her most powerful teleportation magic, and which she could only use once every half year to get to this place. She flew full speed ahead while carrying Emperor Thanath by the neck. Of course, she had erected a magical barrier around the man as the pressure of the speed at which Fire Sorrow was moving could turn his body into a bloody mist. Not long after Fire Sorrow, a huge dark circle opened up in the void and the members of the demonic army emerged from within under the guidance of Lucifer and Lucia. Seconds later, the same happened with the army of heaven. However, before all of them, there was someone else waiting just in front of the blue planet. A red-edged spatial rift slowly closed as a beautiful woman emerged from within. This beautiful woman was naturally Lilith. Lilith looked at the bright blue world behind her and sighed to herself. Things were getting more and more out of control. Even she, who was ranked as one of the most brilliant geniuses in the history of the firmament, was limited in what she could do. After all, Lilith was not all-powerful. Suddenly, and as if she felt something, Lilith looked forward with cold eyes. "Lilith?" Fire Sorrow was surprised. "How did you get here so fast?" "Who knows?" Lilith replied indifferently. She narrowed her eyes dangerously and the mana in her body began to move slowly as she calmly said, "Fire Sorrow, where are you going?" Fire Sorrow frowned as she realized that not only Lilith was preparing to use powerful magic but also held her sword with the intention of fighting here and now. However, Fire Sorrow's eyes suddenly lit up and she seemed to understand something as she quickly said, "Don't get it wrong, Lilith. I have no intention of hurting this lower existence to silence it, far from it. Of course, I don't plan to betray the faction either. I am just looking for a blue planet." Then, under Lilith's shocked eyes, Fire Sorrow looked at the surroundings with a frown and whispered, if I'm not mistaken, it should be this way." Lilith's pupils trembled softly as she looked back. The bright blue light reflected off her face and her crimson eyes reflected the image of the beautiful planet called Earth. Lilith looked ahead, but all she found was Fire Sorrow flying around trying to find something. What was going on here? Lilith asked in her heart, shocked and in commotion. Couldn't Fire Sorrow see the blue planet behind her? Not much later, Lucifer and Medes leading hundreds of thousands of higher existences appeared in the distance. However, even without them coming any closer, Lilith was sure that none of them could see anything but empty space. This was the first time Lilith experienced such a shock since her birth. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 506, one of the most powerful skills in existence. Planet Earth, China. Amidst corpses that had varying degrees of destruction and several large pools of blood that were slowly beginning to be absorbed by the earth, a huge fleet of several thousand armed humans and several hundred soul evolvers were positioned along a large defensive line composed essentially of war tanks and IFVs as well as several other modified vehicles that resembled metal beasts. Surprisingly, however, despite the fact that there were so many people gathered in a single place and regardless of how theatrical the bloody scene was, the only sound that could be heard at present apart from the whistling of the wind was the occasional distant roar of some wild beast hidden deep inside one of the many forests relatively closer to Baichuan camp. The flow of mana that the soul record could not fully control as well as the remaining soul power within several dozen soul stones danced a couple of meters above the ground at the same time as multicolored flashes of light scattered around creating a simply beautiful sight worthy of a fantasy movie. The contrast between fantasy beauty and horror tetric was so great that were it not for what was quietly unfolding more and more, everyone might wonder how it was possible for two extreme opposites to coexist in such a way in the same place. Xietain had practically held his breath for so long that he would have easily broken the previous world record right before dying with his lungs shriveling up like a cartoon. His eyes were fixed intently on the huge ball of light that gleamed like a small artificial sun just above his head, anxiously waiting for the process of evolution of the skill regeneration to end once and for all. Beside him, Shangwen Bingshui was no less nervous than him at all as she watched the definitive development of everything with her beautiful face looking considerably pale. People like Evangeline, Niangong Yi, Niangong Langxin, Fu Shuifeng, Kai Jingyi, and even Kang Lan who had stopped evolving her skill after noticing the commotion, as well as many other soul evolvers who were part of the small core of Xietan's faction, watched his and Shangwen Bingshui's strange behavior with eyes full of questioning signs. None of them could understand the reason why the two of them, who were the core of the core, were behaving so strangely. It was as if the wounds on Xietan's body were suddenly no longer so important from a certain point of view even though they all could see two huge holes running through him from side to side. There were even a few burns that were slowly being healed by the high health stat of him, but in fact, none of them were aware of the great stake that was taking place a short distance ahead and none of them could ever imagine the huge treasure floating right under their noses that was about to disappear to become something completely unknown. Bang! Suddenly and without warning, the bright light hovering 3 or 4 meters above the ground contracted before bursting and shattering in a manner similar to a crystal glass. However, unlike the crystal, the magic particles that were charged with mana so everyone could see them were quickly absorbed by a kind of small glowing red pearl that slowly began to descend. That's Xietan's pupils contracted slightly as he watched the small crimson pearl gently flying towards him. What is that? Shangwen Bingshui was dumbfounded as she carefully observed the small object that rather than a small pearl was not very different from a headache pill except that it had a suspicious color. Wasn't Xietain supposed to be evolving a skill? What was going on then? Why did that little red thing come out as a result of what should have been a process of evolution? Shangwen Bingshui realized that the skill Xietain wanted to evolve clearly hadn't changed at all yet or else he wouldn't be as calm as he was. Xietain seemed not to hear Shangwen Bingshui's question and as if he was in a trance he simply extended his hand forward. The small red pearl fell gently into his right palm and Xietain looked at it confused and nervous at the same time. He could clearly remember how some time ago, inside his workshop located in the north area not long after Xietain was forced to fight against the Second Order Archaic Bear which represented another one of his most difficult and fierce battles to date, Something similar to what was happening just now took place. When Xietain tried to evolve his skill blood manipulation together with Lilith, he also obtained a small pearl that was exactly the same as the one he was holding now. Simply out of curiosity, Xietain tried to see the records recorded in the small pearl. However, not to his surprise, all he saw was a series of question mark and nothing more. Although Xietain just cannot understand how it was possible for something to exist that was literally born using the soul record's power as its source that the soul record itself could not read, he not only did not have the energy to raise such questions, but he knew perfectly well that he would only be wasting his time, since the current him was just an insignificant being who would never get any answers. If he wanted answers, then he first needed to be powerful enough to get them, or at the very least to go in search of them. Xietain took a deep breath and without further ado swallowed the little red thing. After all, this wasn't the first time he had to go through this process for the skill he wanted to evolve to grow. Maybe he was still too weak, or maybe this was how he was supposed to be to begin with, but Xietain felt absolutely nothing strange after swallowing the strange little object. Then, a message flashed in his retina, and with anxiety, as well as nagging fear, he read it to himself. Regeneration, 3rd order active skill, level 1. Regenerates 50 stamina points for every 1 mana point consumed. No cooldown time. The face of Xietain turned as pale as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight in his childhood years. His legs trembled and strength left his body as he realized that apparently, his judge was wrong. Even if recovering 50 stamina points in exchange for a single insignificant mana point was more than impressive, as it was basically turning him into an inexhaustible combat beast, Xietain was far from being satisfied, and undoubtedly at this moment, he felt he was suffering a great loss. If Xietain was in more advanced stages of evolution and his faction was more steadfast, then he would undoubtedly be more than happy with this kind of outcome. However, at present, he did not need to consume mana to regenerate stamina. His current combat power should be enough to swiftly wipe out any earthborn enemy. Hey! Shangwen Bingshui quickly moved to support him just as he was about to collapse. She was startled to notice that not only was he tremendously pale with no trace of blood anywhere in his face, but even his body felt as cold as a corpse because he was covered in a cold layer of sweat. Just as everyone became agitated at the sight of Xietain about to collapse, more green letters appeared in his retina as if the soul record was toying with him. Regeneration. 2nd activation. Overlap regeneration. Except for the stat health, you can take all the points of one of the other 5 stats and add them for as long as you wish, up to a maximum of 5 seconds to a different stat. This activation depends on the body instead of the soul, so it consumes large amounts of energy to activate. It consumes 50 stamina points per activation and has no cooldown time. Big Brother Bei. Luoning, who had recently awakened after having fainted several hours ago from consuming all of her stamina and most of her mana, as well as having received a great mental shock, rushed forward when she saw Xietan's miserable condition. The eyes of the girl were full of tears, and the sadness in her stare was so deep that even a demon would be moved by seeing her like this. She was not worried about the environment at all, nor did she seem to care that Xietain did not look anything like the usual Xietain, but looked more like a strange monster with all the wounds on his body and an arm of blood. All that Luoning's gaze conveyed was concern that came from deep in her heart for the person to whom she owed the most and to whom she was most grateful in this world. However, no matter how worried the gaze of Shangwen Bingshui, who was holding him as if he was the most delicate thing in the world, and regardless of how much Luoning sobbed beside him, even if the world collapsed before his eyes, it was highly unlikely that Xietain would react. The state of shock that Xietain was in at this moment was undoubtedly among the greatest and most terrifying he had ever experienced in his 20 years of life. In fact, up to this day, Xietain could not recall ever being as shocked as he was right now. Overlap regeneration. He muttered as his eyes stared vacantly ahead. Overlap regeneration, the 2nd activation of the skill regeneration, was still something completely different from what Xietain was expecting to obtain after evolving regeneration to the 3rd order. What Xietain was expecting was that at some point the skill would transform into something that would allow him to consume mana to boost his recovery rate to new heights, or even a 2nd activation that would allow him to recover from fatal wounds once every so often at best. However, what he had gotten in return was simply insane nonsense. There was no way to describe it other than with the words batshit insane. Xietain had some really powerful skills in his arsenal. Among them, the skill gravity manipulation was arguably the most dangerous and probably the 2nd most versatile skill he possessed, but at the same time, it was also the weakest of them all, as it depended on other skills to show its true power. On the other hand, there was also the extremely destructive skill Crimson Blood Judgment, which after being enhanced by certain skills had even endangered an entire race. There was even the most versatile skill with the most possible uses, Blood Manipulation. Not only did it serve to wipe out large armies in a matter of minutes, but it also helped to speed up the body's recovery rate and even suppress the enemy's power to a great extent. However, if someone were to appear in front of Xietain right now and ask him which skill he believed was the most terrifying of all, he would have no hesitation in answering, not gravity manipulation, not blood manipulation, not crimson blood judgment, not even the power of the endless blue lotus flame. Overlap regeneration. This was undoubtedly the skill that currently occupied the highest point in Xietan's heart despite being a mere second activation and despite being recently obtained. The number of thoughts and the number of ideas that surged in Xietan's heart were so many that he could do nothing but store them all to study them later in a manner similar to a supercomputer. But in fact, Xietain was not wrong, because the skill overlap regeneration was not only one of his most powerful skills, it was also one of the most terrifying skills that existed in and out of the firmament. And, even more terrifying, overlap regeneration was far from being in its final stage. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 507, Overlap Regeneration plus High Rank Recovery equals Hell. There were many things that needed to be tested with the skill Overlap Regeneration. However, Xietain was clear on what would be the first use he would put it to. "I'm fine," he said, trying to act calm. However, it was clear that the excitement in his voice betrayed Xietain as Shangwen Bingshui looked at him doubtfully and couldn't help but ask in a low voice, "Success?" Even if she did not explain what she was referring to by success, Xietain naturally understood that what she meant was whether the evolved skill had been worth the price to pay. He looked at her with shining eyes and said in a deep voice, "Right now, even if I meet that Ghost Emperor for a second time, I'm sure I definitely wouldn't end up in this miserable state I'm in and would probably be able to give him a good farewell gift even if I couldn't kill him." Shangwen Bingshui's heart skipped a beat and she looked at Xietain with surprise. Soon, however, all the surprise she felt turned to joy. "That's great," she exclaimed as her blue eyes shone brightly. The excitement on Shangwen Bingshui's face was as clear as the rays of sunlight slowly fading away to let the darkness descend over the world. Seeing this kind of expression on her usually cold face would naturally have left many dumbfounded if not for all the crazy things that happened in such a short time. In fact, Xietain even went so far as to think that if it weren't for the fact that there were too many people here, Shangwen Bingshui might have jumped on him to hug him. Or maybe he was too excited about acquiring such a powerful skill and so now he was even thinking too many nonsense things. Pushing all thoughts to the back of his head and determined to end all this as quickly as possible, Xietain looked at Kanglan and asked in a deep voice, "Have you finished evolving your skill?" Kanglan snapped out of her surprise and hurriedly nodded, "Yes. Although I can continue evolving it for another level, I need too many second-order soul stones to proceed. I think at this point with how high the leader's health stat should be plus my skill, your arm should be able to link back together after a week." "A week?" Xietain repeated Kanglan's final words with a strange expression on his face. Was his stats health being underestimated? Not to mention now that Xietain had received such a monstrous skill. However, Kanglan thought that he was not satisfied with the results so she quickly added, "Leader, don't worry. Even if during this time it fails to connect your arm perfectly, it definitely won't rot so there's no need to think of countermeasures to prevent it from rotting." Shangwen Bingshui took a step forward and looked at Xietain to give her opinion. "Xietain, even if you can't move your left arm for a couple of days, there's no need to worry," she said with a small knowing smile. "After all, I don't think that on the current Earth there is any enemy capable of handling fighting you for more than a few minutes even if you only have one arm. By the time a few more days pass and under Kanglan's care, you will come back stronger than ever." Xietain shook his head and in his heart forced a smile. Although he understood the thoughts of the two women in front of him, it was difficult to explain his own. Therefore, he decided to prove it with actions instead of words. The first thing Xietain did was to ask Kanglan to whisper in his ear all the records of her newly evolved skill. After all, Xietain had already learned after experiencing in the past that sharing one's soul records with another existence could lead to deep soul wounds, so he did not dare to test whether Kanglan was able to share records with him. The physical body of Xietain was wounded at high levels and his soul was too exhausted after everything that had happened today. Even if Xietain was brave, he was not foolish to take the risk of even damaging his soul. One needed to know that stats were primarily etched into the soul of an existence, so if the soul was damaged the stats would plummet until that damage was recovered. At a time like this, the last thing Xietain wanted was to lose stats. High rank recovery, second order active skill, level 4, increases the healing power depending on the user's magic stat and the target's health stat, where the higher both stats are the greater the effect will be. Now, you can not only heal light wounds but even those on the verge of death can be brought back by you depending on the power difference between the target and the user. Increases the power of bone healing x5. The skill can be used 10 times per day and consumes 20 mana points per activation. The difference was clear as day. Compared to the skill recovery, high-rank recovery was undoubtedly superior in every possible aspect. The only bad thing was that Kanglan did not have 200 mana points yet, so it was impossible for her to activate all 10 times in one shot. However, there was no problem as long as she was allowed to take a short break to recover mana. This way, Kanglan could use the 10 daily heals without too much headache. Xietain's eyes lit up with joy when he saw that now the healing power also depended on the target's health stat. Previously he had thought that in 2 or 3 days at most he would return to his peak condition. However, with things as they were, he could return to his 100% even today. After all, the skill overlap regeneration did not allow Xietain to take points from his health stat, because if he subtracted the health points to 0 then he would die, and even taking a few points could be disastrous. However, the skill didn't say anything about increasing points using other stats. Kanglan, when I give you the signal, use all possible healing on me without stopping, Xietain said in a serious voice. Receiving Xietan's intense gaze, Kanglan was nervous whether sitting or standing. Even she, who had no liking for anyone or much less was no stranger to Xietan's charm. Of course, this did not mean that she was falling in love with him and was just a woman appreciating a handsome face just like men did with beautiful women. Alright. She nodded and muttered under her breath. Receiving the healer's confirmation, Xietain looked at his status window just to make sure which stat he would use next. Xietain. Status points, 20. Level, 50. Race, human. Class, Blood Berserker. Subclass, Lord. Soul Contract, Endless Blue Lotus Flame. Titles, One Hit to Kill, Irregular, Brilliant Mind, Savior of the World, Destroyer of Destroyers, 1 vs Millions. Strength, 850. Plus 55. Agility, 970, plus 95. Health, 663, plus 20. Stamina, greater than 1185 less than 1216, plus 35. Mana, greater than 41 less than 751, plus 65. Magic, 759, plus 155. Just in case, but I decided to put between the symbols the amount that Xietain has at the moment since he recently experienced several battles. Skills. Active, Blood Manipulation, 2nd order active skill, level 3, Crimson Blood Judgment, 3rd order active skill, level 5, Regeneration, 3rd order active skill, level 1, Shadow Blink, 1st order active skill, level 1, Lightning Movement, 2nd order active skill, level 5, Invisibility, 1st order active skill, level 1, Gravity Manipulation, 1st order active skill, level 5, Void Fist, 3rd order active skill, level 1, All for One, 3rd order unique skill, level 5. Passive, Special Forces Soldier, unranked passive skill, level 5, Stoneheart, 3rd order passive skill, level 5, Superhuman Health, 1st order passive skill, level 5, Silver Skin, 2nd order passive skill, level 1, Mechanic, unranked passive skill, level 5, Throwing, unranked passive skill, level 5, God of War's Will, 3rd order passive skill, level 5, Blacksmithing, 1st order passive skill, level 5, Danger Sense, unranked passive skill, level 5, Enhanced Dexterity, 1st order passive skill, level 5, Blood Berserker's Wrath, unique skill. Xietain had grown a lot and his status window was proof of that. He could still access to his old records, and after comparing the first time he saw his status window with the current status window, his growth became much more noticeable. That status window not only reflected his full strength but also reflected each of the records that Xietan's soul had absorbed after countless battles to make him what he was today. Regardless, Xietain realized that his highest stat was undoubtedly the stamina stat with over 1,200 points in total. Therefore, it was clear which stat he would use to boost his health stat for a couple of seconds. As this would be the first time Xietain would use overlap regeneration, he did not dare to bring his stamina to 0, as he had no idea what would happen, and what Xietain least wanted was to faint out of nowhere or suffer even worse consequences. Therefore, he decided to play it safe for now. Xietain silently activated overlap regeneration, and suddenly a strange golden light enveloped the outline of his silhouette. As everyone looked at him in surprise, as at this moment he looked like a god despite his beaten condition, Xietain quickly dislodged the blood arm and brought his left arm to the shoulder joint as he hurriedly said, "Kanglan, now." As Kanglan extended both hands forward and the magic began to dance around her, Xietain hurriedly borrowed 900 points from his stamina stat and unhesitatingly added them to his health stat all at once. Xietain felt every pore of his body open up at the same time, and the wounds on his body began to heal at speeds that could only be described as monstrous. However, Not everything was rosy, as he immediately felt every cell in his body go wild as if having consumed some kind of magic drug. As if the aforementioned was not enough, the sudden loss of stamina hit him with a wave of exhaustion that almost sent him straight to the ground despite still having over 200 points. The unbearable itch made his face twitch a little, but the worst was yet to come. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. In just a second, Kang Lan had sent 3 white orbs of light with golden flashes toward Xietain, orbs which were absorbed by his body. Ugh! Xietan's eyes widened in an instant, and a small grunt that would have been a cry of pain if not for him restraining it escaped from his mouth. But this was just the beginning. Swoosh! 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 Kang Lan sent another 4 orbs filled with healing magic into Xietan's body in a span of just 2 seconds. Her face turned as pale as a sheet as her steps faltered and she almost fell to the ground. Kang Lan had just consumed all her mana in one shot, so she immediately became nauseous as if something important was missing from her organism. However, there was no doubt that the one who was living worse in this place was Xietain. Regardless of whether there were thousands watching him, this kind of pain was not something a living being could bear. Even for Xietain, who was tenacious and cruel against himself, couldn't help but let out a terrifying scream towards the sky as he rolled on the ground. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 508, God's Attack and Earth Destroyed? What Xietain was feeling was by far the worst pain he had ever felt in his life. He literally felt as if his muscles were being torn apart over and over again to make room for healthier ones. His broken flesh was growing at speeds visible to the naked eye, and the severed ligaments were stretching to bind together once again in an attempt to regain the lost connection. As if this were not enough, Xietain was itching on a level so great that a million fire ants stinging him at the same time would probably not be able to compare. Even during the first week of the apocalypse, when Xietain fought the First Order blazing beetle and his lower body was almost turned to ashes by the creature's fire skill, the pain and the discomfort had not reached the level it had reached now. Ironically, all this was happening not because he was being hurt, but quite the opposite. It was because his body was healing too fast. The nerves in Xietan's body were sending the new signals to the brain all at once to keep up with the accelerated pace of healing, so one could only try to imagine how terrifying was the experience he was undergoing. Xietain heard panicked cries all around him and even saw the worried expressions of several people that he could not identify at the moment, as everything around him was a blur. In fact, he had not even realized that he was screaming and writhing due to the pain that assaulted him. However, even though Xietan's brain was overloaded, he knew very well that he could not afford to lose knowledge now. The 5 seconds passed, but an instant later they restarted again as Xietain spent 50 stamina points again to add the same 900 points to health. Then, he activated blood manipulation, but instead of using the skill to hurt, he used it to support the healing process. Above all, he focused on his left arm. As everyone watched what was happening, Shangwen Bingshui suddenly realized that Xietain at this point was incredibly weak. He was so weak that in this moment an unclassified soul evolver could take his life. At the same time, everyone who tried to approach him would be in danger, since at this moment Xietain clearly did not know what he was doing, and if by oversight or coincidence he hit someone, then that person would definitely be sent directly to meet King Yama. To avoid any kind of trouble, Shangwen Bingshui waved a hand and quickly fashioned several small but visible ice walls around her and Xietain. "No one is allowed to approach," she said in a clear voice that could be heard even in the distance. "Anyone who gets too close will be seen as a traitor trying to kill the leader, so for the own safety of each of you it would be best to stay where you are." Xiaoming seemed to wake up after hearing Shangwen Bingshui's words. He blinked and looked around before loudly shouting, "Everyone! Stop being lazy and start guarding the area. The night is about to fall and the beasts might soon come out of their lairs to get some food." Xiaoming was loyal to Xietain all the way to death, so even though his position was no big deal within the faction, everyone respected him as he was a fairly senior member, and everyone knew well that he got along especially well with many of the high echelons. Therefore, after hearing Xiaoming's roar, everyone began to pay more attention to the surroundings, even though they occasionally glanced at the man writhing behind the thin semi-transparent ice walls. As Xietain writhed in pain, the changes on the outside of his body were noticeable, as the slight golden glow around him was not enough to cover Shangwen Bingshui's view. The burns on his chest disappeared in an instant without a trace. The 2 holes Jack had left on his torso began to close up with flesh and skin growing rapidly, and even the left arm that had been cut off in its tracks was beginning to show signs of movement. What an impressive healing ability! Shangwen Bingshui couldn't help but mutter in shock. She looked at Kang Lan as if she was a priceless treasure and gradually began to understand why on earth Xietain would care and look after this girl so much. From the day Kang Lan joined Xietain, from that destined moment when she obtained the lesser healing skill scroll and revealed her talent for magic after telling Xietain how high her mana and magic were, he had been giving her special care. Defensive treasures always had her as a priority, When it came to forging mage equipment, Xietain clearly focused more on her defense than anyone else's, and even though Kanglan possessed powerful attack magic, he rarely allowed her to participate in extremely dangerous wars. Being looked at like that by Shangwen Bingshui, Kanglan could not help but feel ashamed in her heart. Even though she knew that she was a genius since Xietain had told her so on many occasions, and the fact that her monostat was so close to 200 points even though she was only a level 26 existence actually proved it. Kanglan was 100% sure that Xietan's healing speed was not especially linked to her. Sure, her high-rank recovery skill and Kanglan's stats especially had possibly done 70% of the work. However, that 30% was by no means insignificant and was being worked on by Xietan's own body. 30% might not seem like much compared to 70%, but if one took into account that Xietain had built up the 30% without any healing skills and only relying on his health stat and partially on his blood manipulation skill, then things were different. Kanglan was full of admiration toward Xietain in her heart. Even as he writhed on the ground like a worm, his image did not diminish at all and instead only increased more and more as she watched his body slowly return to its peak. While the two women, as well as the rest, struggled with their own emotions, Xietain struggled to stay awake and not lose consciousness. Therefore, he did not notice that something very small that seemed to be sleeping while hiding in a deep corner of his soul released a faint crimson radiance with black edges. Solar system, just above the atmosphere of planet Earth. Fire Sorrow, you. Michael, the mighty fire archangel belonging to the army of heaven, pointed his spear at the talented 7th Order mage as he shouted in anger. Fire Sorrow looked on as both the army of heaven and the demonic army stopped at a distance close enough to distinguish each of their faces. She didn't lose her calm at all and after a slight glance continued to scan the surroundings with a scowl. Michael was furious when he was ignored. When had he, a 7th Order archangel of the army of heaven and only beneath God, been ignored and humiliated in front of so many eyes? If word got out, wouldn't he become a joke and his reputation go down the drain? You bastard. That's good, Michael. Just as Michael seemed about to explode, a soft but firm voice sounded next to him. Meads activated one of his skills and from his body as the center, an explosion of silver light spread through all the members of the army of heaven. Everyone's expressions immediately became softer and calmer and even the burning anger shining in Archangel Michael's eyes gradually receded before disappearing without a trace. I apologize, Lord. Michael bowed slightly to Meads before looking at Fire Sorrow with a disdainful expression as he said, this young one couldn't help but get angry at seeing the stupidity of certain individuals. Again, despite knowing Michael's words were aimed at her, Fire Sorrow ignored him. She had experienced countless things in her long life to get upset over something as small as being teased by someone else. Humph. Michael snorted and didn't pursue the matter any further. Time passed as everyone remained silent. Fire Sorrow continued to fly around and even flew out of sight before returning several minutes later with the same confused expression. Occasionally, she seemed to ask questions to the Emperor of the Asura race who was still being restrained by her, but the frightened man did not seem to be giving her the answers she expected judging by the look of depletion in her purple eyes. During all this time, Lilith felt several stares on her body. Of course, among these stares were lust, crush, and many other emotions. However, there were two gazes that especially bothered Lilith and made her a bit anxious. Her ruby eyes moved around the area until they met Lucia's eyes and Lucifer's intense gaze. She looked indifferent as without moving from her position she calmly asked, "Is something wrong?" Surprisingly, it was neither Lucia nor Lucifer who responded but Meads, the Lord of Heaven. "Young lady, if you don't mind, could you tell us how you traveled faster than anyone else this far?" Meads inquired in a soft voice. "More than anything, how did you know the place we would be going to?" It was understandable that Meads and Lucifer, as well as a few others, knew what Fire Sorrow had in mind along with where she would be teleporting to. However, among those few was not Lilith. It should be impossible for Lilith to know what Fire Sorrow had in mind after hearing what Emperor Thanath said, and it should be even more impossible for her to reach this area of the universe so fast since those who knew her were aware that she had only been training space magic under the guidance of Fire Sorrow herself for only a month. Therefore, doubts would naturally arise in everyone's hearts. Lilith looked at Lucifer and realized that he had no intention of interfering even though the one questioning her was the leader of another faction, which meant that Lucifer himself also wanted to know the answers to the questions Meads had raised. However, who was Lilith? She had lived through enough cruelties and experienced enough hell to fear anyone. If she didn't want to answer, then she wouldn't answer even if they killed her right here, and even less now that she knew that for unknown reasons Earth was not visible to any of the beings on the scene except herself. Therefore, she looked Meads straight in the eyes and said casually, "Who knows?" The scene fell deathly silent and Lucifer's eyes flashed strangely as he stared at Lilith. Even he had not expected that kind of bold reply. One had to know that Meads was one of the oldest and most powerful existences in the entire universe. Even Lucifer was not confident of defeating him in a 1 versus 1. Arara. Gabriel muttered as he looked at Lilith with wide eyes as if she had committed some sort of taboo. Meads narrowed his eyes and pointed a finger forward. The mana within his body moved under his command as gently as the spring breeze, and under his powerful impulse of magic, a considerably small magic circle appeared in front of him. There was no warning, and even Lucifer did nothing to prevent it despite knowing what was about to happen. Boom! A huge beam of white light shot out from the small magic circle in Lilith's direction. The feeling of being dead embraced her for an instant before under her shocked and surprised eyes the magic attack passed beyond her. Directly flying towards the earth, Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 509, You Can Call Me Lilith. Lilith did not even have time to look back, and her first instinct was naturally to try to protect the blue planet. After all, that was the world where Xietain was based. However, Lilith knew perfectly well that despite being a genius capable of fighting against someone an order above her, she was not Xietain after all. Even fighting against a 7th-order existence was a challenge for Lilith, let alone facing the Lord of Heaven. Regardless of whether it was stats, combat experience, general experience, mana control, control over magic, and speed in casting magic spells, Meads surpassed Lilith in all of these by a considerably large margin. But how could he not surpass her? Lilith was not even 100 years old since she was born, while Meads was one of the oldest beings in the universe. Lilith felt her heart tighten to the point where it was difficult to breathe. Time seemed to have slowed down for her, and the only thoughts that went through her head were two. Her first thought was naturally her goal. Why she was doing all this to begin with, why she was working and enduring so much. Before she met Xietain, the only reason why she continued to breathe and the only reason why she decisively stood up even though her soul was so hurt after experiencing so many bad things throughout her life was precisely this goal. It might be ironic, but before meeting Xietain, Lilith had planned to complete her life's mission and then seek for the eternal sleep. After all, why would someone who had already lost everything live? However, after she met the lower existence known as Xietain, Lilith's thoughts began to undergo subtle changes. These changes were so gradual and small that she did not notice them until not too long ago. Although Lilith was relatively young when compared to the rest of the higher existences or any third-order being onward, she, as bad as it might sound, was old enough to be the grandmother of someone as young as Xietain. Therefore, she naturally had more experience and knowledge regarding the feeling called love. Lilith did not know whether she was in love with Xietain or not. However, she was fully aware that she now awaited the arrival of a new day with greater enthusiasm compared to the past, where she was not much different from a machine that lived for a single purpose. Unlike in the past, she now had someone to chat with without having to worry about anything and without having to be bored by lustful glances or confessions based on her charm. She longed for the descent of the moon and the rise of the sun so that the human named Xietain would wake up and she could chat with him more. The last month had been more difficult than Lilith had expected because as the days went by, she could not wait to return to Earth, more precisely, to return to wherever he was. This naturally meant that at the very least she was beginning to feel strongly attracted to him, and Lilith was fully aware of this fact, or else it would be impossible that a couple of days of training magic would be enough to shake her mentality. At the very least, Lilith was 100% sure that Xietain was a very, very precious friend to her. Soon, however, this would all be gone. In the blink of an eye, Lilith's goal would become an impossibility, as the only existence capable of helping her achieve it would die without even knowing why. At the same time, in the blink of an eye, the reason why Lilith now waited and longed for the descent of the moon and the rise of the sun would disappear forever, leaving her alone again. Lilith did not know the reason why Mead suddenly attacked the Earth. She also did not know why he could see the planet that apparently no one else could. However, it was clear that as a consequence the god of heaven would soon be killed by the soul record. However, so what if Meads died? Was it of any use? At the end of the day, it was all over for her too. Lilith remembered a sentence she once read somewhere. It was a short line from the conversation between an innocent girl and a little white rabbit. How long is forever? Sometimes, just a second. That was how that 1 second felt to Lilith. Eternal. With her ruby-colored eyes burning with anger like a volcano about to explode and her heart as dead as a rose whipped by the cold winter storms, Lilith raised her sword and pointed at the sky above her head while looking at everyone present with killing intent. Since she had already lost everything, then there was no need to hold anything back. Not only was Meads going to be properly punished by the soul record, but everyone here was going to pay a price they could never get up from. Once someone's heart died, all that was left was pure indifference. Let the universe tremble for several million years and let the blood of these proud beings be the price to pay for your life. Lilith prayed inwardly with chilling indifference. Bloody succubus, what are you doing? Lucifer suddenly stepped forward and asked loudly to get her attention. Lilith glanced sideways at him, and although she noticed Lucifer's confused but at the same time slightly tense expression, there was something different that caught her attention even more. She looked in the direction of the army of heaven and then looked up at the sky in search of something. However, there was nothing there, no lightning. Not nothing. Lilith didn't know what method Fire Sorrow had used to survive the wrath of the Soul Record, and in her condition of sadness and anger she ended up forgetting that since Fire Sorrow possessed such a method, it wouldn't be at all strange if Meads had his own as well. But it's fine anyway. Lilith smiled beautifully as her eyes glittered with bloodlust as she looked at everyone. Even if the Lord of Heaven doesn't die, he may no longer have heaven to rule over several millennia from now. Suddenly, the smell of blood began to spread in the surroundings. It started out as just a faint smell, but at lightning speed, it grew to the point where that faint smell reached the level of being nauseating. Even the dark outer space began to tinge slightly red as if real blood was spreading like waves throughout the universe. Firmament fragment, Uriel exclaimed with surprise in her beautiful golden eyes. It was hard for her to believe that the beautiful woman in a black dress belonging to the demonic army had not only managed to ascend to the Sixth Order when she was less than a century old, but even possessed a firmament fragment. Which firmament fragment is this? Gabriel frowned as he looked at Lilith with slight concern. He really hated everything unknown. The members of the demonic army were also shocked. Just as I expected. Valiant nodded with a serious expression on her face. Bloody succubus Lilith really is the holder of a firmament fragment. This. Helsker tried to catch the red blood only to realize that all he was accomplishing was staining his hands redder and redder. What firmament fragment is this? Is it for attack? Is it for defense? Besides, where the hell is that damn smell of blood coming from? Lucifer and the rest naturally did not answer any of Helsker's questions, as even they had no idea what was going on. However, the leader of the demonic army had a bad premonition about it, so without losing his composure he looked towards the army of heaven's lineup and said to Meads in a loud voice, "Hey, old man. Why are you suddenly attacking a member of my faction? Apologize to her or do something about it if you don't want me to attack one of your angels in return. Let me tell you that I haven't slept in several hours, so my accuracy might not be as good to narrowly miss as you just did." Meads scowled at Lucifer and a flash of anger shone in his eyes. Suddenly, however, he caught something in Lucifer's eyes that made him realize that things were not as simple as they seemed. Although the Lord of Heaven did not understand what was going on, he was a man of sufficient experience to let pride and arrogance get in his way. Therefore, he looked at Lilith and with a slight smile said in a magnetic voice, "Young miss, don't you think that using the power of a firmament fragment just to be the punchline of a joke is too much? I think it will be better for you if you save that fighting eagerness and strength for the war that will be fought in the Crimson Rift in the next few years." "A joke?" Lilith muttered and just randomly glanced back, expecting to see nothing but rubble. However, Lilith soon realized that in the midst of fear and grief she had overlooked something very important. And that was the fact that as powerful as even the most insignificant magic attack launched by Meads was, it should have caused a colossal explosion after hitting something. Lilith's pupils twitched violently as she stared in disbelief at the scene before her. The Earth, which should have been destroyed, was perfectly intact there amidst the darkness of the universe, barely illuminated by starlight. Lilith felt her heart race brutally as she watched as the previously blue planet seemed to be covered by a blanket of crimson light with black lightning all around. She felt that the Earth was just an illusion, like a mirage in the middle of the desert that after reaching out to touch it would disappear. In the distance, a flash of bright silver light was moving farther and farther away until shortly after it exploded in the distance after impacting probably with some asteroid. It was the beam of silver light that Meads had launched earlier. Lilith didn't know what was going on, but she quickly realized one thing. It was clear that the Lord of Heaven, God, had not especially targeted Earth by any means. It had been a mere coincidence since Lilith, the target he was trying to scare, was in the way. She couldn't remember how long it had been or when her emotions had last been stirred like this. She had literally just experienced death and then the revival of her emotions in a matter of seconds. With her heart previously turned to ashes now beating again, Lilith let out a great internal sigh as every nerve in her body relaxed. But she knew that regardless of what was happening and regardless of whatever was going on with the Earth, she could not give strange signals, as she had no confidence in hiding anything from the old jackals watching her closely, especially Lucifer. Lilith had already realized that the Demon Lord was beginning to strongly suspect her, so it was best to stay away from him, the more the better. With indifference, Lilith looked at Meads and said coldly, "I hope the Lord of the Army of Heaven won't joke with me again. I only joke with my friends, and in my life I only had 3, of whom only 2 are living. One of them is very far away in many senses of the word, the second will live forever in my heart, and the third is closer than the first but also farther away. You are none of them, so I hope you will refrain with your jokes, since as you may have noticed I am not particularly friendly." Meads was dumbfounded. Everyone was dumbfounded as they looked at Lilith in amazement. This succubus of the demonic army was not only tremendously beautiful but also terrifyingly brave. To think that with her 6th order strength she would actually dare to speak to Medes in that arrogant tone not once but twice. Did she really believe that just because she had a firmament fragment, she was unrivaled under the heavens? There were several beings among those present who were firmament fragment holders, and Medes was undoubtedly one of them. Ha ha ha, Medes chuckled lightly. Even his smile was really attractive, and the sound he made when he smiled was magical. God looked at the succubus and said with a cheerful smile, "This is the first time in a long time that someone has spoken to me nonchalantly without fear of my position, and that is really very precious. Young lady, may I know what your name is?" Is this person an idiot? Such a thought was naturally born within Lilith. However, she simply smiled beautifully, knowing that everything would be fine, and her heavenly voice stretched out as she slowly said, "You can call me Lilith." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 510, Annihilation equivalent to almost 1/7 of humanity and legend-grade treasure. Planet Earth, China. After approximately 30 seconds of hellish suffering, the pain that lashed every cell of Xietan's body and that drove him to the brink of madness on several occasions receded to a point where it was no longer intolerable. Slowly, Xietain stood up with his body drenched in sweat and covered in blood stains that obviously did not belong to him but belonged to the battlefield where hundreds of thousands of Asirs had been slaughtered by him hours ago. He took several deep breaths while Shangguan Bingshui and Kanglan stared at him closely in amazement. He examined his body carefully and surprise flashed in his dark eyes. The 2 holes that pierced his body from side to side could no longer be seen anywhere, and the fiery burns left by the flaming spear that Glenera used to fight him in the oblong world disappeared as if they had never been there in the first place. Xietain looked under his left shoulder, and a sigh of relief automatically fled from his mouth when he felt that connection that had been lost before. "Are you okay?" Shangguan Bingshui took a step forward and circled around his body several times as she asked softly, "Your arm? How does it feel?" Xietain did not respond and instead walked toward one of the mountains of corpses where at least a few tens of thousands of bodies belonging to the Asirs that had invaded Earth. The mountain of bodies was about 7 or 8 meters high, and when Xietain stood next to it he looked like a toy doll in comparison. Xietain took a deep breath, and strangely or not he was in no way disgusted by the slightly putrid smell that was slowly beginning to fill the air. The corpses, in a battered state, after being exposed to the sun for practically the entire day, were starting to decompose faster than normal. Under the eyes of thousands, Xietain jumped with vigor and rose more than 15 meters in an instant, surpassing the height of the mountain of flesh. Then, he activated gravity manipulation in reverse at its maximum possible to decrease his falling speed tremendously and casually observed the ground beneath him. Overlap regeneration. Xietain whispered under his breath. Flash. That distinctive golden glow once again surrounded the outline of his silhouette, giving him the appearance of a god who had descended to the mortal world. Xietain silently borrowed 500 points from his agility stat and transferred them momentarily to his strength stat. Then, he turned his body in the air so that his head pointed toward the ground and activated gravity manipulation, except that this time he increased the gravity around him x 15 times. Bang! In mid-fall, his body caused the air to explode several times, and just before colliding with the top of the mountain of corpses he clenched his left fist hard and punched forward viciously without holding back at all. This was a punch that charged the natural falling speed of a body multiplied by 15 times, added to almost 1,500 strength points. Boom! The mountain of corpses practically collapsed when Xietan's fist connected with the first body on the top, and a thunderous explosion resounded at the same time as the moon began to rule over the sky. Some soldiers fell to the ground on their butts as the earth rumbled and vibrated, while others let out shrill screams as they were not expecting anything like this at all. Boom! Boom! The ground collapsed, forming a crater over 200 meters in diameter, while cracks several tens of meters in length extended on the outside of the crater. The corpses disappeared as if they had never existed, and instead what filled the air was a dense cloud of blood that slowly began to float downward as it was attracted by the gravity of the world. Strangely, however, all of the blood cloud began to gather in a single point bit by bit. Shangguan Bingshui walked to the border of the crater and looked down at the central part as she said, without knowing whether to laugh or cry, "Was it necessary to do such a thing?" Xietain was standing in the center of the crater with a satisfied expression on his face as he lightly clenched his left fist. No one but him understood the fear he had felt earlier at the thought that he might never be able to regain his lost limb, and only he could understand the thrill of regaining it in the midst of despair. Xietain raised his head slightly and looked Shangguan Bingshui in the eyes as he said with a faint smile, "Well, I also wasn't sure if my left arm was still working well, so I had to try it. Besides." Xietain paused for a moment and surveyed his surroundings proudly as he said aloud, "Look, didn't I save a lot of work and time?" The corner of Shangguan Bingshui's mouth twitched a couple of times. Her bright blue eyes scanned the inside of the crater, and in her pupils reflected the gleam of a few thousand small objects with different colors that had been embedded in the earth. All these small objects that glittered with multicolored lights, creating a beautiful sight, were naturally thousands of soul stones. Xietan's previous punch had crushed the corpses, but if there was something that he could not destroy with mere physical strength, it was the soul stones. Therefore, the pressure of the punch and the air it carried behind it pushed all the soul stones into the crater, causing them all to become embedded in the ground. "I wonder about that." Shangwen Bingshui sighed and raised an eyebrow as she stared at him. "Now we won't have to send a team to drill heads, but we will have to send a team to dig into the ground to get all this stuff out of here." Xietain shrugged in return and said with a defeated expression, "Don't worry about small details. You can't always achieve the best result, can you?" Shangwen Bingshui shook her head and smiled toward him as she said in a clear voice, "Congratulations on your quick full recovery." Xietain looked at her and smiled slightly in return. The night passed extremely slowly as there was much work to do. Therefore, even though Shangwen Bingshui and Xietain were mentally exhausted after all they had been through in just one day, neither of them could close their eyes all night. The first thing that was done was to gather all the most needy survivors of the Baichuan camp, where Xietain introduced himself as the new top leader of the camp. Then, he offered large quantities of mutant beast meat for these survivors who, although not starving, were beginning to show signs of malnutrition after feeding only on gruel or rice for so long. In this chaotic world where rules were lost, where there was food, there were people willing to work hard to get it. Therefore, Xietain easily gathered several hundred men and women willing to work hard for several hours and sent them all to gather the soul stones that were stuck inside different craters which had been formed by Xietan's blows after transforming the bodies of all the hundreds of thousands of Asuras into a bloody mist. Of course, all that bloody mist was returned to its liquid state and then duly stored in the liquid storage pearl, since Xietain needed to recover his blood supply. After all, the blood that he previously stored had completely evaporated when Xietain formed the giant blood trident in the Oblong world. Therefore, except for the second-order blood needed to make magic brews, Xietain needed more blood in order to use his blood manipulation skill. Next, Xietain dispersed his trusted men among the human army that formerly belonged to Baichuan camp to guard the 4 gates of the base. After all, nighttime was the best time for the mutant beasts to attack with a surprise attack. While those leaders who had been delegated by Xietain to important positions within the Blood Spear Legion took their troops with them to occupy the strategic points and the most important areas of the base, Shangwen Bingshui personally took it upon herself to communicate with the central base 2 days away and reported their total victory. Chen He along with a few other powerful soul evolvers immediately left for the north to escort the huge caravan that would move southward as soon as the preparations were completed under the care of Lu Xiaoyao and a few others. Fortunately, the night passed without too much trouble and Xietain was able to settle down easily in what was formerly the mayor's villa. It was 7 a.m. when Xietain finally sat up in his new bed and plopped down on his back. As his outwardly recovered but internally exhausted body bounced up and down on the comfortable mattress, his black eyes gazed at the chandelier hanging from the ceiling with decisivity. Suddenly, a round and bright glow appeared in his line of sight. Just as he was startled, several messages flashed across his retina. Mission Destroyer of Destroyers finished. The current is deemed unable to return to the abandoned world. Calculating success rate. Calculations completed. Completion rate equivalent to 20%. Recording major achievements. Xietain closed his eyes and sighed as he slowly sat up. As expected, even after all that, it's only 20% out of 100%. Xietain was not too surprised by this result. After all, Oblong world was too large and he had barely managed to kill some tens of millions of Asuras either directly or indirectly. Although he had managed to deal a great hit to the Asura race, it was far from enough to shake the roots of this race that had existed for who knows how long. This was not to mention the other races that probably inhabited the abandoned world, such as the Ghost race that Ghost Emperor Jack had told Xietain before. Therefore, a 20% termination was even more than what Xietain had expected. If the full power of my last Crimson Blood judgment had been spread correctly, things might be different though. He sighed again before slowly sitting up. More messages flashed across his retina. Major accomplishments explored and recorded. Direct killing of 2 third-order existences. Direct killing of 210 second-order existences. Direct killing of 58,157 first-order existences. Direct killing of 5,834,619 unclassified existences. Indirect killing of 11,682 second-order existences. Indirect killing of 552,518 first-order existences. Indirect killing of 857,267,428 unclassified existences. Sorting by gender and age. The numbers of people who lost their lives either directly by the hands of Xietain himself or as a result of his devastating attacks began to appear before his eyes with precision. One by one, the soul record left out none of them. All of these soul records were forcibly etched into Xietan's soul as if this seemingly supreme being was unwilling and not in the mood to let him forget. Xietain sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at his hands. His steady, cold dark eyes blinked as multiple complex emotions flashed and his gaze fixed on a single point. His hands were white, so white that there was not even a speck of dirt on them. However, in Xietan's eyes, his hands were far from white. There was nothing there and he knew that what his eyes saw was just a mere illusion created by himself. But to him, his hands were as red as a demon's where there was nothing but filth. Almost a billion lives. Xietain whispered and let himself collapse again. As he looked at the glowing ring that slowly gave shape to the treasure that the soul record would give him as a reward, he muttered in a flat voice, "In just one day, I took the lives of almost a billion living beings. If this were the Earth, then about 1/7 of humanity would be annihilated in just the span of a few hours. Children, women, old people. All of them. Even newborns." These were much higher numbers than Xietain expected to see. Even with his determination, feeling the names of nearly a billion lives being recorded onto his soul, and even being forced to learn their ages, Xietain naturally felt sorrow for what he did. Even though it was kill or be killed, even though he had grown so much in such a short time, the reality was that it had only been a little over 2 months since it all began. Even if Xietan's personality had been affected by countless aspects that forced him to change, he still did not forget that 2 months ago he was nothing more than a young man who easily mixed in the crowds. Xietain sighed for the third time in a matter of minutes and slowly stood up. He reached out his hand toward the ring of bright light just in time for the light to burst out and reveal what was hidden inside. He didn't bother to look at it right now and with steady eyes but his heart somewhat heavy, he said to himself, "Time to meet my family." Now, no one could stop him. As he opened the bedroom door to head for the shower, a message flashed across his retina. "You have received Cyan Orb, Legend Grade. I just pray to God or the devil that they still live. And if they are alive, I hope they might be able to accept a monster such as myself." Bang! The door closed firmly and the room was silent once again. The remaining glowing particles of soul power danced around the luxurious room, slowly dimming until they disappeared completely, leaving behind nothing but darkness.